Welcome back and thanks for watching. I really do appreciate it. Please like, share, and subscribe to my channel. This video today is on 14-bolt regear and locker in a differential. I think this video might spread well beyond just my rock crawling viewers, because I think all the 3/4 and 1 ton Chevys from about 73 or 4 up use a 14-bolt. There's an early version and a late version too, but aside from that, the gear's all set up the same. Now, a 14-bolt and a 9-inch, if you can do a 14-bolt, you can do a 9-inch, because they are the same, other than the 9-inch, you can take the housing out onto the bench and rebuild it, whereas the 14-bolt in a GM is integral. You have to build it in the housing. So those are the two differences there. Now, these are a really popular axle for Jeep conversions, off-road conversions, because they're abundant. There were a bazillion of these things made. They're easy to get parts for, and on top of that, they're very strong. One of the big pluses on a 14-bolt, which is the same as a 9-inch, the nose bearing on the pinion creates 3 bearings total on your pinion, which eliminates deflection off of that gear. That deflection is what can cause gears to fracture under shock load. So it's a little more insurance than just a 2-bearing pinion. Now, this 14-bolt has a couple differences we're doing. One is we are changing the spanner nuts to a Crane manufacturing spanner nut that has the ability to press an inner axle seal, which is the same inner axle seal that a Dana 60 front steer axle uses. We're changing those on the rear of this because the rear axle of this is now a steer axle. They have cut the ends off, put knuckles on, and it turns. So you have to have a way of keeping that fluid in the differential and not coming out the axle tube. So we're going to change those spanner nuts over with the seals in them. The other thing I am doing different on this one, and I recommend this on any rear end that you are going to work on, or for any kind of performance rear differential or front differential for that matter, if you have a crush sleeve, you can replace it with a spacer and shim assembly. That way, if you blow a pinion seal or something like that, you can swap that pinion seal out, tighten the thing down, and not have to worry about over torquing a crush sleeve and ruining your bearing preload. So this is going to be a good one for those of you with trucks and rock crawlers and stuff that crosses over from one genre to another. Here we go. The cover's off, the shafts are out, and the fluid is drained. As I'm pulling stuff apart, I always try to look for things that could be a problem. Well, I found 2 problems initially. First of all, there is no preload. When I loosened the pinion support up, I knocked it forward a 1/4 inch, and I still don't have hardly any backlash. So when that pinion support's all the way in, that verified I had a load on the teeth. Now I'm pulling these caps off and the spanner nuts, which you should be able to just use a punch and turn them back out, are locked up. So I'm going to have to use a hammer and beat on these to get those cut loose. Absolutely ridiculous. Yay! Oh. That could have ended really bad. Of course, once one side's loose, the other side will loosen up, because the carrier will come loose then. Now generally, you don't need to take these spanners out, but I am, because we have to change these to the style for a rear steer, which is a big reason for doing this. Even though we're doing a gear change, I got something to show you. As I stated when I started doing this 14 bolt, which we'll do the normal how to set up gears on a 14 bolt because they're a little bit different than a Dana 60 or a Dana axle altogether. 14 bolts and 9 inches are almost identical, except the 9 inch you can do on the bench. The 14 bolt you do inside the housing. So these are the spanner nuts, which you squeeze in and squeeze out, move left and right in order to set your backlash. We are going to change these with this spanner, and what you see is this machined surface here. That's the big difference. The seals go in as such. Almost idiot proof. You can flip them, but you can also take them back out once you figure that out and flip them back the right way. These have the guide that allow the axle to go in without tearing up the seal. I've already put some grease on the seal. You just tap them in to where they're flush and you're ready to go. This one here I've not in yet. Just walk it around. You can use a punch if you need to. I usually just use a hammer until they're tapped flush. You can tell when they're all the way in. Now these spanners just thread in like any other spanner would. They are precision machined. These are built by Crane, by the way. Crane does a really good job when it comes to differential machine and cool aftermarket stuff. I will heads up, these are easy to cross thread. Make sure they go in freely by hand. No tools needed. And we're going to run these all the way in, and then after that we're going to set this gear change and Detroit locker up just like every other 14 bolt. So I'm going to do a couple quick explanations, which, like I said, these are like 9 inches except you do them inside the housing. This is the pinion section, which has a support section, and the nice part about this is we can set our preload up on the bench right to specifications. We don't have to worry about our pinion depth. Our pinion depth is set with these shims, which go between the pinion support and the housing. Our ring gear side, we don't have to worry about butt bearings or setup bearings on this. They did not bring me a new set of bearings. I'm not worried about it. Bearings don't look too bad. They probably were replaced when they put the rear end together incorrectly. It's probably never been run since it does not have any axle shafts in it. So bearings you can press on right off the bat. Our backlash is set with those spanners we just put in. Now, something that is a little bit different. You see these set of ring bolts here. We have to take those off to replace the ring gear anyway. When we take those off, the two halves of this carrier split apart. We will take the spider gears out of here and we will insert a locker assembly. And then it squishes together. You can also get mini spools in these. We'll see what this looks like when I get this apart. The front one was welded. I'm guessing the rear one may have been welded too. So let's rip this apart, get it ready to assemble with the new stuff in, and we'll see what we look like. While I'm doing this, I just wanted to show you this. I'm sure this was put together with an impact and way over tightened. These bolts should not take that much effort to remove. This impact's 450 pound torque in the off position. The worrisome part about when the bolts have been torqued that tight is how bad were they stretched. You can see this bolt's, I can't even pull it out. I'm going to put new bolts in this. Don't get scared. Just tap around the back of the ring gear and it'll slide it down. This is, as they say, an orb of traction. It's welded on all four corners. They ground it down so it would fit back in the case. At least they made it serviceable so that the case was reusable. I've seen people actually weld them into the case, and that just makes a mess out of stuff. No, you do not use the thruster. So we won't. I will tell you this, don't take the little magic bolt off until this is in together and you're ready to install it. I've done it, but these springs are a mother to get in. These are fairly simple. Set them in, grab a new ring gear, and some new bolts. We'll be ready to put that back together. Okay, I got them snugged up. Now for the fun part. Torque wrench. These dowel pins are handy in a 14 bolt because you can put a big long 1/2 inch extension in them and hold it in place a lot easier than a chain wrench. Again, I mark all the bolts as I torque them. Now the carrier is ready to go in. You don't have to put the pinion in first. You can put this in, just leave it loose so you're not going to bind teeth up when you put that in. I'm going to pull the little keeper out for the locker. Because you don't want to forget that inside really hard to get this thing out once you're installed. We'll just see how tight this is. I've had these so tight that I've had to put C-clamps around the jaws in order to keep them from spreading apart. Hopefully I won't have to do that. Again, everything I find on this has been overdone. This has half a tube of silicone in the splines. That is completely unnecessary. Wow. Another thing I'll show you before I pull this out, look at this seal. It's not even seated. Word of caution, I did knock the inner race out of the pinion support because using these style of pullers, you really have to use the bearing race to keep the bearing together, otherwise it'll just tear the bearing apart. A little too thick. I love that bearing puller. You never, well, I have broken a couple bearings, but it's pretty rare. Before I put the old pinion up, again, I always look at the size difference. You've just got more mass when you're doing a low ratio. Just less risk of breaking something. Make sure everything matches. This is a thick gear, by the way. This is a 410 and down carrier. I am running 456 up gears, so in order to not change the carrier, you have to put the thick gear in. Okay, 14 bolts. I have a new crush sleeve. I'm not going to use it. I am going to take the time and order a crush sleeve eliminator. Then I can install this just like the spacer I did on a Data 60 or 44 or anything else. What that's going to do for me is if I need a pinion seal replaced or I break a yoke or anything else, I can remove this nut, reinstall it and tighten it down to a torque spec and don't have to worry about destroying my bearings or anything else because of over torquing or crushing a crush sleeve that is already torqued. So I'm doing this 14 bolt with a crush sleeve eliminator, which I prefer using on any of them. It gives them more serviceability. But I know there's a lot of people that are going to watch this and going to be doing a 14 bolt with a crush sleeve. And so I think it's important enough to explain how to do the crush sleeve and what the crush sleeve is actually doing. Now, on a 14 bolt, you've got the pinion support, and when you're using a crush sleeve, you are going to put it together once. There's not put it together and measure something or any of that like you would do with a shim type. So, you're going to put this together once. Make sure you put your new bearings in, your new races in. You're going to use the new crush sleeve. You install the new pinion seal. You install the yoke with the new washer and the nut. Now, when you're assembling all this, make sure you put a little bit of oil on your bearings. Make sure you put a little bit of grease on the seal, on the pinion seal. I also put a little bit of oil on the threads because that pinion nut is going to take an extreme amount of pressure to crush the crush sleeve. I also put a very thin film of silicone on the back side of the washer underneath the pinion nut just to help eliminate oil seepage through the splines. Now, crush sleeve. Inner bearing, outer bearing, crush sleeve. The crush sleeve rides on the inner race of both the inner and the outer pinion seal, or pinion bearing. The races are already pressed into the housing. So what happens is when you tighten that pinion nut up, it's squeezing this crush sleeve. And once you tighten the nut enough that the inner races have both seated against that crush sleeve, you're ready to start crushing. It may have already started a little bit of crushing. But at this point, you're still going to have a little bit of play in the pinion gear. Now, what does it take to crush a crush sleeve on a 14 bolt? You see me tightening a lot of these pinion yokes down to about 250 pounds. That's where this will end up after it started crushing. But to start a pinion crush sleeve crushing in a 14 bolt, it's usually about 400 to 600 pounds of torque. It's a lot to get them to start. But once they start crushing, it goes really, really fast. So if you're using an impact, you know, and you get everything snugged up, as soon as you start reducing the play in that pinion, I would strongly recommend stopping with the impact, locking this thing up in a vise, you know, the yoke, clamp it down, and start crushing it by hand or with a breaker bar and a big socket. The reason being is once this crush sleeve starts crushing, it goes really, really fast. And as soon as that play is gone from the pinion gear in that housing, it might take less than a quarter turn to go from 0 inch-pound reading to 30 inch-pound reading. So go in very, very small increments by hand until the desired preload is met. Now, that preload is nothing more than how tight those bearings are pushing into the race to obtain the preload reading. The amount of pressure on the crush sleeve between the inner races is going to be quite a bit, because wherever this preload on the bearings is at, you know, 15 to 30 inch-pounds, the torque on that nut is probably still over 250 pounds of torque. So once you obtain the correct reading on your bearings, stop. You're finished. Don't go anymore, and don't take it back apart, because once you take it back apart, you'll have to get a new crush sleeve. These are not spring-loaded. They're one-time use. So when you're ready to do your pinion support on a 14 bolt, put all your new parts together, get the play out of it, go in small increments by hand until you obtain the correct preload, and you're done. All of the pinion depth adjustments are done strictly with the shim between the pinion support and the main housing. They have nothing to do with the crush sleeve. So your crush sleeve's only job is to put preload on the bearings and create a high enough torque on the pinion nut to keep it from coming off. That's it. All done, right? We're ready to go. While I'm waiting for my crush sleeve eliminator to come in, I'm going to go ahead and install the carrier and ring gear. Well, one would think. All right, with the carrier in, I'm just going to snug these up enough to push the carrier in. I really don't want to tighten them. Because I got lots of play in here. What I do want to do is I want to take some of that play out. And I want to take it out with the ring gear further away from the pinion. I will move these back. I am going to take this one out just a little bit, just because I know it's close to being bottomed out. But for the most part, I'm going to bring this out and snug this up using the tooth side so that it keeps it further away from the pinion. Okay, now that I've got that, I'm going to snug these just a hair more. Okay, I've got it snugged up. It's smooth. Now I'll set the pinion in. I did want to throw a couple of reviews out there. On these pinions, there's generally numbers stamped on the end. But when you have these nose bearings or support bearings like 9 inches and 14 bolts have, all your numbers tend to be on the side. Crush sleeve, spacer, and shims. Now, if you measure a used crush sleeve and the shims, you may want to just start there or be a little bit thicker, like 1/1000 or 2. So I'm going to put the whole ball of wax on, see where I end up, and go from there. I'd rather take stuff out than put stuff in. Also, the inside of this spacer here is machined, so it will only fit on the pinion one way. The other way it just drops down and stops. You need this resting between both bearings. So I'm going to put this in. I've got about 3 threads and we'll tighten her up. With the pinion fully tightened, I can lift this up and down. So I'm going to have to take a chunk of those shims out, and then we'll tighten it back down, see what we get. Had quite a bit of play, so I'm taking these 3 shims out, leaving these 2 on. 20 to 35 inch-pounds, use 8 to 11. Now, keep in mind, I don't have the seal in here, which generally you would have in here during a crush sleeve type. I'm at 10. Now I'll put a seal in here and double check it, but there's no play. It's nice and smooth. The great part about this is just like I said, I'm going to get a new seal, put it in here, and I won't lose my preload now that I've done a crush sleeve eliminator. Again, just to point out the pamphlet that Yukon sends with their gears, I've also gotten this online, so if you don't have it, you can look it up. But Yukon has this pamphlet for all the torque specs for the gears you're setting up. My favorite part is the pictures for your pinion depth contact pattern. And remember, any of these acceptable patterns are good. Don't try to get one versus another. I never really cared for these two patterns, but they are acceptable. It was just how the gear is machined. Just as important, these patterns show you that harsh line, which means on these the pinion is too close, and if your harsh line is up at the top, that means your pinion is too far away. So again, I just want to reiterate, pinion depth is your first critical measurement. If you don't get this right, the rest of the measurements really aren't going to matter. I decided, since that other seal hadn't been pressed in all the way and it looked like it had been rubbing, I curled this one over the lip a little bit once it was seated. That way I don't have to worry about the dust cover. Recommendation, put a little bit of grease or oil or something on all these surfaces. Okay. We're all bottomed out, so this should be where I can check it again to make sure our readings are good. Once I am finished with this part, absolutely hit it with a torque wrench. Make sure you're at least, 250-ish pounds. They don't really give you a torque spec on these once they're no longer a crush sleeve. But I found about 250 pounds is more than adequate with the lock nut. It feels good, it's smooth. The preload is now set. Next, we're going to install this to the housing. Remember, the carrier's in there now. I'm going to add the original shim to this. Keep in mind, these only go on one way, so you can get them backwards. This one goes on not like that. I'm now ready to install the pinion support and the pinion gear to the housing and start running a contact pattern for the pinion depth. Now remember, pinion depth is your first critical measurement and adjustment. You need to make sure you get your pinion contact pattern to an acceptable pattern. If you don't, your gears are going to be noisy and they're probably not going to wear correctly. Taking the time to make sure you get an acceptable pattern is very critical, because if that's not set up right, it really doesn't matter if the rest of the adjustments are within specs or not, because it's not going to work right. That being said, I'm also not going to use the terms pinion is too deep or pinion is too shallow, because those are usually not used correctly when you are talking about differential theory versus practical application. I use the terms the pinion is too close to the ring gear or the pinion is too far from the ring gear. Way easier to keep those straight when making your adjustments. All right, now we're ready to make some pinion adjustments. Got the original shim and the pinion support. It's all lined up. I've got 2 bolts started. Make sure you got lots of play. Once I get it close, I'll throw a couple bolts in to squish the shim down. Now we're in, you see I've got all kinds of slop here. I've got the cap bolts, remember we put those in snug. I'm going to back off one, tighten the other, move the carrier over until I just get some of the play out of here. Okay, we're pretty close right there. I'm going to back this one up, take the rest of the play out. A little bit more play. Not too much. Oh, that's fine. Okay. Got a little bit of preload. I'll make sure I'm smooth. Get some marking paint. A light coat of marking paint over a few teeth is all you need. You don't have to goop it up. I've got preload on the bearings on the pinion. I can run this back and forth and get a pretty good idea. If it's way off, it's going to show it right away. But the best and most accurate way to get a good contact pattern is putting a load on this and turning the pinion with a big wrench or a socket. You'll see me do both ways. Once I get close enough to an acceptable pattern, I'm going to hold my ring gear, put some load on it, and then I'll turn the pinion, which is what I'm going to do now. I use the flashlight to line up and make sure my paint is on the tooth where the pinion is. Get this out of the way here. So, and I hold resistance on it both directions. Once I run it through a three times, I bring it back around, take a look at the pattern. Now we will see where we're at. Coast side, looks like we need to come closer, and so does the drive side. Bring it in here a little bit. And you can see how it's a harsh line up top and a rolled line down at the bottom. That means the pinion needs to come closer to the ring gear. Yeah, there we go, underneath. You can see how it's harsh line on the top and then a swept line on the bottom towards the valley. That tells me the pinion gear is too far away. So I need to take that shim out or replace it with a thinner shim. So I know that I have to take this out, but before I yank that pinion out, I'm going to back off the ring gear because I know I'm coming in closer to the ring gear with the pinion, but I just don't want to take the chance of chipping a tooth. So I'm going to move the spanners to move that back out. Now I'm going to come back to the other side and I will pull the pinion support back out. Tap the yoke a few times, and now it's out enough to where I can use a couple pry bars and just pop it out. I know I need to bring the pinion closer to the ring gear. Put this back in without the shim, snug it back up. And again, now I gotta get my backlash at least close enough to get a fair reading. You can live with that. Okay, we're the other direction now. Bring you down here again. Now you can see I'm exactly the opposite. My harsh line is down at the bottom and round at the top. And the same thing, well, it isn't as bad underneath. It's a little off underneath. This tells me I really need to split the difference between no shims and that shim. Well, I do carry 14 bolt shims in my shop, so I don't have to wait on this one. But generally, shims for 14 bolts don't come with kits. This one is 10 thousandths thinner than this one. That will probably get me really close. Always got to make sure you get the shim aligned because, like I said earlier, this stuff only fits in one way. The reason the pinion support only fits in one way is because of the oil galleys. The oil needs to sling from the ring gear through the pinion, and that way it will lubricate the bearings. And I wanted to show you a little trick here. These teeth right here have not been painted. What I wanted to point out is you can see where it comes in and goes out. You can see a hard goop of yellow at the top. So if you're not getting a clear paint pattern because you got brush strokes or too much goo on it, you can always look at the next set of teeth. However, here is my drive side, which I can live with that. And there's my coast side. This is pretty close to picture perfect. There is absolutely no harsh line. The only harsh line you can see are my brush strokes. We are even top to bottom. It comes in even and goes out even. Once you reach the position of it's an acceptable pattern, sometimes you can go one more shim and it will clean that pattern up a little bit. Sometimes it won't. Once you're in the range of acceptable, your gears are going to wear right and you're not going to have a noisy differential. And I was told once that, you know, you get a differential with steep gears, kind of like this has, 538s, because they're spinning so fast, you're going to have noise anyway. I'm going to say that is generally false. If your gears are set up right, they're going to be quiet. Yes, you might get a little bit of bearing noise for high speed spinning, but gear noise, they should be quiet regardless of what speed they're at. So this one, we tried it with the original shim and the pinion was too far away. We took out that shim and it was too close. So I knew I had to split that shim somewhere. So I was, you know, 20 thousandths or 25 thousandths shim. I changed it 10 thousandths. So we almost split the difference and I got a good pattern. Now, I don't have a 2,000th shim for a pinion on this. The next one I have is 5 thousandths different. So I go 5 thousandths different and I got a bad pattern again. So I know this shim is the right shim for this particular set of gears. Don't get too hung up trying to make the pattern more perfect or less perfect than this other picture. There are a lot of acceptable patterns, and the key to an acceptable pattern for a contact pattern is it comes into the gear smooth and it leaves the gear smooth. Top and bottom should not have a lot of super harsh edges. Once you get it coming in and out smooth, it'll work for you. Once you have a good pinion depth pattern, get your backlash close and put a little bit of preload on the spanner nut. You do not need to hammer spanner nuts so tight that they bind the bearing. Cool. 10 thousandths, bring you down here. Like I said, I'm getting some really bad reflections down here, but just under 10, but okay. Now I'm going to finish torquing all the bolts, including my pinion side. Got to put a pinion guard on there when I do that as well. I will take a final reading once everything is torqued to make sure nothing changed, or if it did change, it's still within tolerances. This is always tons of fun with trusses in the way, but this could actually give me a better pattern on my pinion, because if there's any air gap at all on those inner bearings, it's going to push it forward or backwards. We'll see what happens. If I were just doing this on the bench with a crush lathe, this would be set. But since I have a spacer in there, and tight's tight, so I don't have to worry about this change in preload, but I want to verify that I have enough torque on that nut that it won't back off. So 250 pounds is where I generally go on those. And I go in stages. Tight. Torque her back up. Just for grins, I ran another pattern. And you can see that cleaned up really nice. It's centered on the drive side and on the coast side. I'm really happy with that. I am going to share with you one of the 14-bolt pinion depth tricks of the trade. Now, we've been doing this one kind of by the book. We've set up our preload on our pinion support, we've installed it, and we are adjusting our pinion depth by removing and adding shims to the pinion support. What happens if you remove all the shims from your pinion support, you install it, and your pinion gear is still too far away from your ring gear? You're out of shims. What do? Well, what I do is I disassemble everything. I remove the bearing from that pinion gear, and I add a thick shim between the head of the pinion and the inner pinion bearing, press it all back together, reinstall it, and discover then you're going to be way too close to the ring gear, probably to the point it would bind even. And I always recommend, if you're going to do that and you run into this situation, use a thick shim, because then you will have to add shims to the pinion support to bring that pinion further away from the ring gear and dial it in. And you can really dial it in well by doing this. So we've also discussed your pinion preload is set up with a crush sleeve, and it's a one-time deal. So my recommendation, and this is how I do gears, when you are assembling your pinion support to do your pinion depth check, I don't do a final assembly on my pinion gear to start with. I use the new bearings and everything, but I do not install the new crush sleeve, I don't put the new seal in, and I don't use the new nut and washer. I assemble the pinion support to where I have no play in it and I've got some good preload on it. Then I install it and I set up my pinion depth. That way, if I have to add that shim to the inner pinion bearing and pinion head, I can do it without destroying my one-time use crush sleeve. I can fine-tune my pinion depth and get it very, very close. Once I know my pinion depth is correct, then I can pull the pinion support out. I can add the crush sleeve, the seal, the new nut and washer, and do my assembly accordingly. Reinstall it, and my pinion depth will be on the money. But if you're using a crush sleeve eliminator, you don't have to worry about that, because you can disassemble the pinion gear as many times as you want without really screwing up anything like a crush sleeve. So that's kind of my tip of the day right there. This particular differential, I did some preliminary checks, go figure, and knew that I would not have to add a shim between the head of the pinion and that bearing, but you can do that if you need to. Like I said, I've done that more than once, and it is not that uncommon to run into that situation. So keep that in mind when you're doing these assemblies. I always recommend getting your pinion depth dialed in before final assembly, and makes life easy. Doing them when you're kind of finished up, run them around a couple, 3 revolutions to make sure you don't feel anything that just doesn't feel right. If your pinion depth is way off or your backlash is way off, as you turn this, you're gonna feel kind of the corners of the teeth, and it'll feel like nothing, it's just not meshing right. So both directions I'm going on this feel really good. Another thing to look for when you turn it around a couple revolutions, if it's stiff in one spot and easy in another, put your dial indicator on the edge and check your run out. Make sure you don't have a warped ring gear. As long as it's smooth, I rarely check that. I've only, I think, in 30 years had one pinion that was even questionable. Got my spanner nut keepers in. Backlash is checked. My pinion is dipped correctly. I'm ready to button this one up. All right, cover's on. Just adding fluid now. I just use regular 80-90 weight in this. I use conventional oil, and I always use conventional oil on differentials unless the manufacturer calls for something different. And be aware of that because a lot of the new electronic locking differentials do require synthetics. But otherwise, I just use your basic 80-90 weight. Okay. That's going to do it for this video on 14-bolt regear. I really thank you for watching. Please like, share, and subscribe. I hope this video is useful to those doing 14 bolts. I'm going to kind of continue with this little series of differential videos. I try to cover different things on all of them. I think the next one I've got lined up is going to be a Dana 30 in a later model JK, which is a crush sleeve, and it's going to have a crush sleeve going back in it. So it's going to be a little bit different than what I've been doing on this buggy, but I like doing these kind of videos, and I think they have some value. So thanks again for watching, and we will see you next time.